Hi, folks. Now, we're going to find out, mostly next time, that progress is a scary thing, but we've already had hints of that for this unit, more than a few of them. After all, Mary Shelley's Victor Frankenstein built a monster. A big old monster, as Victor Frankenstein set out with the best of intentions and more than a little human ego and a passel of foolishness and made a monster. So next time we'll talk about if progress is monstrous by nature. But right now, another question, because Victorians were confronted by the science that potentially could make that monster and that challenged all sorts of preconceptions and notions of the world. And we're going to get a little glimpse of some of that challenge. We'll start with our little glimpse by asking that question, how old is the Earth? Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett rather facetiously gave an answer to that in Good Omens, the novel we'll be looking at toward the end of the class. And that number they came up with is because someone toward the end of the 19th century, a theologian, decided he should count all of the begats back in that Old Testament book where they named them off and total the years and came out with that year. Now then, before our era here, though, scientists seldom raised that question of how old the Earth was because it just kind of was and had been, and this was accepted, including accepted by the Enlightenment deists and agnostics, because nobody knew much of what to do with it. It was assumed the Earth didn't change much. And Lord Kelvin, excellent scientist, could say, oh, less than 100,000 years, because from everything that he knew about combustion, the sun would have run out of coal or whatever it was and burned out if it was older than that. So that's the premise or the background. Then, early on in the 19th century, James Hutton and Charles Lyle developed the science of geology. Hey, what happens when we dig into the earth? What do we find out about its history? And we found, all sorts of things in the patterns of erosion and change and such as that. Enough that Hutton could conclude pretty absolutely that the earth was very, very old. And we've got other things just upswelling, welling together, gathering us this sense of uncertainty. All of our nice little certain ideas getting holes knocked in them. Atomic theory, come up with by John Dalton around 1802, made the science of chemistry accessible. Before that, we had the alchemical meanderings because nobody could figure out how it worked. We're starting to see some notions of rhyme and reason in applied genetics. And theories of evolution are about from the beginning of the 19th century. Lamarck offered in fairly complete form a notion of the evolution by the inheritance of acquired traits. Erasmus Darwin, as Charles Darwin's grandfather, offered, rather less completely, a similar suggestion. Now, progress, this notion of social progress, was already on the table, more than on the table, accepted, and that's what we'll look at in our next little unit. But progress, big deal since fairly early in the Enlightenment. It's standard to the deist beliefs, the chance that, or the notion that, since people can learn, we can do things better. We can run a society better than we run it. We can do all these neat stuff. Now, this notion of progress, this notion of change, period, partly amid the smoke of the Industrial Revolution upcoming, and partly because it just seemed intellectually so much frightened some generations of the Victorians. Hey, does it shake the foundations of belief to discern that the Genesis creation story might be a metaphor? That the deity did not wake up each of 7 mornings following the ringing of his little alarm clock? Well, gee, I have stated that rather cynically to get you thinking, oh, now, a thing can have metaphoric truth, a lot of metaphoric truth, without necessarily corresponding to physical reality, and there weren't any days for the first several of the 7 days. So, hey, let's settle down on this and let's think logically. But do people do that automatically? No. Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach poem suggests that all of these scientific discoveries shook him. You've got a fairly complete look into the poem in your Canvas notes, so you'll want to get into them. The part that probably or apparently from the language shook Arnold the most was atomic theory. He thought of that and thought about Democritus and an ancient Greek notion out of the Greek philosophy that everything began with these atoms just falling randomly and they began colliding with each other, and the world was that. Ignorant armies, just atomi wandering. Now, Arnold, people have guessed that when he composed Dover Beach, probably early in the 1850s, it was released in print in 1867, which came after. The big thing that we would think about in terms of really shaking Victorian beliefs. Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin jointly released their independently derived theory of evolution by natural selection in 1857. Story on that? About 20 years before that, Charles Darwin made his little journey on the Beagle and visited the Galapagos Islands and looked at the flora and fauna there and studied it and came to some very interesting conclusions about organisms, creatures, and their adaptability. He sat down and started cataloging, writing, and such as that on his idea, and just did that. After that, Alfred Russel Wallace visited, spent a year or two on a couple islands in Polynesia, noted some curious species boundaries and the way they worked, and thought a bit, and put together the identical theory pretty much with thesis outline and evidence in place. Came back to England, and Wallace, not having these social connections, these grand ones, said, oh, who do I go to that will help me release this, get this forward? And someone referred him to Charles Darwin. And Darwin met him and said, oh, I've been working on this theory, the same one, for 20 years. I guess it's time I released it. So, Darwin and Wallace together released their theory of evolution by natural selection, pretty much identical and independently derived. Scientifically extraordinarily strong right from the conception, with all of that work Darwin spent with it and with Wallace's immediate corroboration, independent corroboration. And this created shock. And well, Arnold's awfully good in terms of Dover Beach in offering us that shock. We can find science shock elsewhere. We can find Alfred Lord Tennyson in the Dear Victorian fashion trying to explain everything away with his poem, The Higher Pantheism, and A.C. Swinburne making fun of it with a quite thoroughly mean satire, the higher pantheism in a nutshell, and such as that. Because Arnold, yes, is reflecting the fears of the period because he expected faith to provide certainty, and he was afraid that the naked shingles of the world, the underpinning, the scaffolding, what you get when you take off the beautiful little veneer that we put on the world, were inherently empty. Empty as that atomic theory from Democritus, lacking in love, beauty, and heart. Well, I find it inexplicable myself that some people insist there's some inevitable conflict between the world's physical reality and genuine values. I just can't comprehend it at all. Heavens, I look at contemporary people offering bizarre arguments, people who call themselves scientists saying, well, since it's obvious that the deity doesn't behave like an 8-year-old with a Lego set, there can't be any deity. And religious people countering in the same way, demanding that they should believe in a deity who behaves like an 8-year-old with a Lego set. Well, we have different and varying conceptions, ideas of the deity, because, well, whatever sense, source of deity there is in this universe, and I'll be very vague about that for reasons of inclusiveness and such, whatever it is, bigger, more, beyond our understanding. And so we have all of these fears, like we find in Dover Beach, Arnold, afraid, because, there is more to understanding than he has placed in his little box, more that perhaps we can understand. Thank you, folks.